Good afternoon. I'm François Carrel-Billard, the Associate Director of the European Institute at Columbia. And on behalf of the events organizers, the Columbia Global Center in Paris, the Alliance Programme, and the European Institute, I'm delighted to welcome you to this debate, Can Europe be Sovereign? This event concludes our series of debates started last October about the future of Europe. We have a wonderful team of panelists with us today: Anu Bradford, David Goodhart, Dominique Régnier, and Boris Ruge. And it's my great pleasure to introduce our moderator, Carlo Invernizzi Accetti. Carlo is Associate Professor of Political Theory at the City College of New York and Associate Researcher at the Center for European Studies of the Institut d'études politiques de Paris. He also teaches European politics at Columbia for the European Institute and the School of International and Public Affairs. Carlo works on democratic theory and comparative politics. His research focuses on the relationship between politics and religion, as well as on populism and technocracy. He's the author of What is Christian Democracy?, published by Cambridge University Press 2 years ago, which offers a superb analysis of how Christian democracy has shaped the process of European integration and the European Union as we know it today. Carlo is also the co-author with Chris Bickerton of Technopopulism, the New Logic of Democratic Politics, which was published by Oxford University Press just 1 month ago. I would like to thank Carlo and our panelists for being with us today to discuss European sovereignty. You may have noticed Roger Cohen's article in the New York Times this weekend, which repeatedly quoted calls for European sovereignty by President Macron. So we hope that this debate comes at the right moment. Carlo, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Francois. Sorry, it's a pleasure to be here, to be moderating this discussion with such a distinguished panel of guests. I just want to make a few introductory remarks about the question we'll be discussing, then introduce our guests, and then begin the discussion. The question, as Francois mentioned, is, can Europe be sovereign? This is, of course, a very topical question in light of a number of statements made recently by key European leaders and policymakers. As you may remember, in his September 2017 speech at the Sorbonne University, the French President Emmanuel Macron called for a sovereign, democratic, and united Europe. And since then, he has made many other calls for what he calls strategic autonomy of Europe. Calls of this sort have also been echoed by other key European leaders, notably the German Chancellor Angela Merkel has said also repeatedly that Europeans must take their fate into their own hands. At the same time, this notion of EU sovereignty is not uncontroversial. There are challenges to the idea that the EU should be sovereign both internally and externally. Internally, in the idea that maybe the appropriate locus of sovereignty is not the European Union as a whole, but its members or nation states. And externally, in the idea that maybe the coordination problems are so difficult for achieving this kind of sovereignty that this might be a pipe dream. Or even normatively, some people think that a sovereign Europe is not desirable if Europe is to be part of an international law framework based on multilateralism in which there are no sovereign entities. So obviously, this notion raises a lot of very important questions. Today, we're going to be focusing on a few in particular. What does it mean to begin to say that the EU is sovereign? In what domains? Whether it's a good idea? Do we want the EU to be sovereign? And if so, how it might be achieved. Before I move on to introduce the guests, just a little bit of how this discussion is going to proceed. We have decided, in keeping with the format of this seminar in general, there will not be presentations by the guests. I will just be raising questions, and the hope is that they will be able so to interact with each other. Instead of giving long speeches, we will have more time for discussion. There will be about 40 minutes of preliminary discussions where I raise the questions and the speakers discuss amongst each other. And after that, about half an hour of Q&A from the attendees. So you can raise your questions by clicking at the bottom of this Zoom screen in the Q&A section. You raise your questions, and I will then be relating them to the speakers. Okay, so let me introduce our distinguished panel of guests. First, we have Anu Bradford, who is the Henry Moses Professor of Law and International Organizations at Columbia Law School. She's also director of Columbia's European Legal Studies Center. Her research focuses on international trade law, EU law, and antitrust law. Anu is the author of The Brussels Effect: How the European Union Rules the World, published last year by Oxford University Press. A book, a great book, which analyzes the international impact of EU regulations and shows how the EU has managed to shape global policy in areas such as data privacy, consumer health and safety, environmental protection, and antitrust, really at the core of our topic. Second, we have David Goodhart, who is the director of the Integration Hub website, also the former director of Demos and the former editor of Prospect magazine, which he founded in 1995. He is a prominent figure in public debate in the UK as a well-known broadcaster, author, commentator, and journalist. David is the author of The British Dream, a book about post-war multiculturalism, national identity, and immigration, and also The Road to Somewhere, another great book about the value divides in British and Western societies. He also published last year Head, Hand, Heart: The Struggle for Dignity and Status in the 21st Century. Next, we have Dominique Régnier, who is full professor of political science at Sciences Po in Paris, and whose research focuses on transformations in political power, public opinion, electoral movements, and populism in France and Europe. Dominique is the executive director of the Fondation pour l'Innovation Politique and author of numerous books, including Populisme, La Pente Fatale, published by Plon in 2011, Le Nouveau Populisme, published by Pluriel in 2013. He's also a frequent commentator in French and European media. And in September 2017, just before the speech by President Emmanuel Macron, Dominique Régnier published an op-ed in the French newspaper Le Figaro calling for a European sovereignty, which was soon after, I don't know if it was a causal relationship or not, endorsed by President Macron. Then we have Ambassador Boris Ruge, who is vice chairman of the Munich Security Conference, who previously served as director for the Middle East and North Africa at the Foreign Office in Berlin, and as German ambassador to Saudi Arabia and as deputy ambassador to the United States. Much of Ambassador Ruge's career has been focused on issues of European security. He worked at NATO headquarters in Brussels during the Kosovo air campaign, and was later posted in Kosovo and in Bosnia-Herzegovina. He was also in charge of European security and defense issue at the Foreign Office in Berlin. So an extremely distinguished panel. It is my honor to be part of this. So I will start by, I think it's useful when talking about such a theoretically loaded concept such as sovereignty, to begin by trying to lay out some definitions. And so I will begin, I guess, by asking Anu, but then opening everybody else. What is sovereignty? How do we understand this concept today? I know that it has a history, that originally it was an extremely juridical concept, whereas maybe there is an evolution in the way in which it is being used. Let us start off with that. What is sovereignty? Anu.
So thank you, Carlo, and good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Really delighted to be part of this conversation. So I think that's the very big question to start with, but to put it in more simple terms and maybe not do justice to the rich conversation that we could have about the term the simple way I would define sovereignty is that it refers to both the capacity and the authority to govern oneself. So if the state is a sovereign, that state is the legitimate governing entity that has the capabilities to govern the state. And I think a critical component there is that you can be in charge of your own destiny, that you are not at the mercy of the choices by others, but you can really more independently, in a more sovereign way, decide the key choices that pertain to your sovereign territory.
All right. Do we want to use that definition as our starting point and move more concretely, or do any others want to qualify it before we move to talk about it more concretely when applied to the European Union?
Carlo, maybe I can add something. Sure. Starting by thank you very much and saying that I'm very happy to be here with you for this discussion about the European sovereignty. Just considering the aspect fundamental concerning the state and the public power. In this aspect, sovereignty is the condition of the existence of a public power as a fundamental dimension, the capacity to defend and promote its own interests. But I want to add something different. We also have to consider the sovereignty as popular sovereignty. And specifically in a democratic order, and when we are talking about EU, we are obviously talking about democratic nations. This is a crucial aspect. The fact to be able for a state not just to do what it is trying to do, but also the fact to be able to deliver what people are waiting for. And so we have here a strong link between the sovereignty as the capacity of a public power and on another side, the sovereignty as a will expressed by people. And in democratic system, and we know that, it's very crucial that both will be able to be connected. So when we are debating about the possibility of the European sovereignty, I think we have to add this dimension, the popular sovereignty as a European level.
That's fascinating. And in fact, this makes me want to immediately already ask a question to David, if I may. Do you think sovereignty requires popular sovereignty? Can, as Dominique suggests, a state or an authority be sovereign only if it actually responds to the will of its members? I'm asking you, David, because I know this is an important component of your book, On the Road to Somewhere.
Yeah, I mean, the European Union was sort of founded as a sort of elite regulatory process that didn't really involve democratic majorities. I mean, that's why it did so well in the early years, and no one really kind of noticed what it was doing. So it managed to establish a fair amount of sort of club rules, and as nation states were members of the club, they had to largely follow the rules. But its sovereignty doesn't really extend to what one might call sort of contingent events. I mean, and the brilliant example for that, of course, is the European Union couldn't even force one of its member states to accept 200 Syrian refugees. I mean, all of the East European states that were refusing to accept the refugees were giving two fingers to the internal sovereignty of the European Union. Its writ turned out not to run. I mean, external sovereignty obviously is another question. I mean, Anu's obviously an expert on this, and soft power projection has been an enormous success of the European Union in all sorts of areas of life that most of us don't really know anything about. But of course, when it comes to military and geopolitical expressions of external sovereignty, the European Union has completely failed. So, for, you just have to list, Yugoslavia, Libya, Ukraine, the kind of list of failure, because, that's not really what it was set up to do. It is still essentially a kind of combination of nation states who, when it comes to the projection of power, have very different priorities and traditions and so on. So it doesn't really work.
So I'll come back to that question of the domains of sovereignty very soon. But before, I wanted to ask Boris, because it seems to me there's an interesting difference between the way Dominique posed the question and the way David answered it. Dominique says, like Macron, democracy and sovereignty go together. Sovereignty is popular sovereignty. Whereas David said, well, no, the European Union didn't start it started as an elite regulatory project. So does sovereignty require democracy, Boris?
I think the EU is a union of democratic states. It has an element of democracy, certainly through the European Parliament and indirectly through governments. But as somebody who's focused on the projection of power, traditional diplomacy, and military power as well, I tend to agree somewhat with David that the EU has not been incredibly successful. So going back to Anu's starting point, I think it's about the ability to act towards the outside world. That's a key element. And in that sense, it's an aspiration. It is not an absolute. So when people talk about European sovereignty, in reality, what they're talking about is reducing the dependency of the European Union on the United States, first and foremost, and enhancing the ability of the European Union to be an external actor in diplomacy, in the projection of force in the 21st century, which seems like it's going to be a pretty rough patch for us. So it's an aspiration that's not an absolute, is what I would say.
So it's a matter of degree. Interesting.
Yeah,
so I'm going to get back to
just a way to bridge what David and Dominique were saying, that as lawyers, we would like to use the word legitimacy. And if we think about legitimacy, it could have the both components, either the input legitimacy or the output legitimacy. And you could have a European Union that is still legitimate in how it is exercising the sovereignty, even if it doesn't enjoy the full popular sovereignty. If we relax the concept to also account for gaining legitimacy through evaluating the outputs of that governance. We don't need to stuck with that question, but I say that we could still probably have the same conversation if we sort of appreciate the different dimensions of sovereignty.
Absolutely. So this is exactly the question I wanted to ask you again, because Anu, David mentioned one domain in which Boris agrees the EU has failed mostly, which is the foreign policy or military dimensions. But I know you've done a lot of work on another dimension, which is the data regulation, and there are many other dimensions in which one could talk about sovereignty. One which is obviously relevant today and we haven't mentioned yet is, health, vaccine, what sometimes people have called vaccine sovereignty. So if it's about reducing dependence on the US, maybe there's a vaccine sovereignty as well. So Anu, does sovereignty mean the same thing in all of these domains? In the military domain, in the data domain, and in the healthcare or vaccine domain? And if not, what does it mean in the domains that you know best?
Yeah, no, I think it is a really important for us to recognize that you cannot have a single conversation about sovereignty writ large. There are many dimensions and aspects of this, and it is well possible that the EU has much more sovereignty on a certain domain than on another domain. And I absolutely agree when we talk about national security, those capabilities, there are great deficiencies in the EU's sovereignty. So the one area that I have mostly worked on is so-called digital sovereignty or technological sovereignty. And there, I think the key question, it has really become one of the main focuses of the conversation over the last couple of years. And I would say that even the technological sovereignty has many aspects to it. So in many ways, the EU has been very powerful in asserting itself and its values and norms as the regulator of technology. It has been very successful in making sure that it sets the rules for the game. It has been the referee, and it has managed to compel or convince or persuade the big American technology companies to follow the EU's regulatory guidance and rules such as the General Data Protection Regulation, many antitrust regulations in the technology sector, the regulation of hate speech online and so forth. So in many ways, the EU has been successful in exerting its authority and hasn't been at the mercy of the others. But we can also have another conversation about the deficiencies in the EU's technological sovereignty, which is that the EU is not producing many of those technologies. If we think about the big technology companies, the Googles and the Facebooks and the Amazons of the world, they are big American companies. Then we have a growing number of very large, influential Chinese companies. So in many ways, the EU has chosen to be the referee as opposed to getting on the field and playing the game and playing offense and playing defense. And I think that's an important conversation for us to have today. What would it take for the EU not just to be a sovereign regulator of technology, but actually a technological superpower that produces those big companies?
That's fascinating. I'm going to ask everybody to respond to that. I'm going to start with David. Would you agree with Anu that if it's true that the EU has been less successful, as you were saying, in some of these military domains, it has developed, it was proved to have a strong regulatory capacity outside of its borders in other domains, such as digital and technological domains? That's what Google accepts deep data protection regulation essentially imposed by the European Union, as I learned from Anu's book. David, would you agree with that?
Yes, although I'm not sure it's a kind of particularly impressive expression of power. I mean, all it really is a representation of the fact that the EU, as it were, sort of sits on 500 million of the richest consumers in the world, or perhaps slightly less rich than some Americans. And that just sort of that just gives it a huge kind of market weight. And all these companies claim, after all, to be merely, they're just the telephone wires. So they're perfectly happy kind of adapting up to a point anyway with local regulations. I mean, the real test for this is going to be when we as Europeans, as individual countries all through the EU, want to kind of impose more serious, we want to kind of tax the digital giants differently, or we want to, like Australia is doing, we're going to insist that they pay the news outlets whose feeds they use on Facebook or whatever it is. Then that's where we're really going to discover whether the EU does have the power. I mean, there was an interesting. I mean, in the I think during the pandemic there was an interesting period where I was following the story in Germany. I was watching my ZDF Heute Journal most evenings, and there was an interesting point where I think the test and trace system was being developed, and I think lots of European countries went through this process of trying to develop their own systems, and eventually realized that they couldn't and had to kind of submit themselves to, I don't really understand the kind of technological background, but they ended up, I mean, the UK included, sort of submitting ourselves to the preferred systems of the digital giants. So, I mean, if that is anything to go by, when the argument gets more serious, we may find that the EU has less power than it imagines.
So this is very interesting. I'm going to ask to weigh in first to Boris and then to Dominique about this. Where do you come down? It seems to me, Anu says it's pretty impressive what the EU has achieved in terms of its regulatory capacity outside, and David says it's not that impressive in these domains. And when push, Schmidt famously says the sovereign can decide when it's decisive, when it matters. And so how decisive do you think the EU's capacity to regulate others is, Boris? And if you can also, how sovereign do you think it has been in the matter of the vaccine, which it seems to me an interesting question. This clearly matters. This is a decisive issue.
Okay, so on the digital, to keep it very short, I think David is right. The power of the EU, of course, derives from the fact that it has this single market, including 500 million people. But that's what gives you weight in a kind of geo-economic system in which we live. So the power of our consumers is important, and the power of our single market is important. That's fine. Let's leverage that for sure. I think it would be more impressive, as Anu herself has said, if we were able to be not just a regulator, but a developer, right, of technology, a leader in that field, which we're not. So that's where we come up against some limitations. On the vaccine, that's really quite a different area. There you could say, after all, BioNTech is a German company that has partnered with Pfizer, an American company, to produce the vaccine that it has developed. So in terms of research and development in that field, obviously we're not doing so bad. But here, of course, the reality is that health is an issue that is handled at the national level, and it is not an EU competency. So we certainly can't pretend that the EU was sort of tossed into this. It was good that the EU tried well, not just tried, but I think came together, took some decisions. But the EU was not and still is not the key actor when it comes to health. And that's perhaps something that we need to change.
Interesting. Dominique, where do you come down on this debate? And then I have a follow-up question, which I know that you've done a lot of work on public opinion in the European Union. So that's another domain. If you say, as you said before, that EU sovereignty requires some kind of popular sovereignty, is there a EU demos, a European public opinion that can be sovereign in that way?
Yeah, but just let me come back on the digital, because I agree concerning the efficiency of the EU facing the big tech in order to regulate the big techs, the antitrust and the protection, the data protection. But it exists a default concerning the regulation of the public sphere. And it's not a little question. I mean, for the first time in the history of the democracy in Europe, the public sphere is not intricated with the general political organization. Because as we know, the right to speak, the freedom of speech in Europe is for the first time regulated not by the American free speech, but by the conception of the free speech coming from the private companies, the big techs. And it's currently is not possible for Europe to impose its own rules, even the national rules. For example, the free speech in France or Germany and all the European countries are not able on the platforms, and I don't see now how it's possible, how it would be possible for Europe to take back the control on this regulation. And I can't imagine Europe, not just a European sovereignty, but a democracy in Europe without this capacity to impose to the big techs the principles of the regulations of the regulation of these platforms.
But then the big techs are going to retaliate, like we saw in Australia. I mean, and then we'll see a conflict between consumer interest in Europe and sovereignty interest in Europe. And I mean, I suspect the consumers are going to win.
David, I think I partially agree, but what Facebook was doing in Australia, it couldn't get away with in Europe. So Facebook did something similar in Spain earlier when Spain had a national law that was very similar and that would have forced Facebook to pay the news publishers. So basically Google, no, actually that was Google that shut down the Google News in Spain. Now, Google has agreed to pay the publishers in France after the copyright directive was adopted 2 years ago and France implemented it. But also, Margaret Vestager, the competition commissioner, made it very clear that if Facebook was to do something that it threatened to do and did for a while in Australia, the EU would have instruments to go after Facebook under its competition laws, the antitrust laws, as the refusal to supply, the refusal to deal with various parties. So that could be an abuse of a dominant position. There, the EU could be relying on the regulatory power that it has. And Facebook has more users in Europe than in America. It has 0 users in China because it doesn't operate there. So Facebook cannot afford to abandon the European market. And maybe also like a slight caveat to what Dominique was saying, that I think you're absolutely right. It's very difficult to fully control the speech that is taking place, that is being moderated online. So we cannot have somebody sitting in Berlaymont in Brussels and read the tweets and decide ex ante whether those tweets comply with the European norms. So these platforms are left with the artificial intelligence and other tools to try to control that speech. But for instance, the leading platforms have signed a voluntary code of conduct when it comes to hate speech, and they remove a lot of speech that would be fully compatible with the First Amendment of American Constitution. They are taking down a lot of content that violates the European regulations when it comes to terrorist content, for instance. There's the Digital Services Act, a new regulatory proposal that was unveiled by the Commission in December that sets very clear guidance and requirements backed by fines as to the transparency obligations, the various due process obligations that these platforms have, so that we know what kind of speech they remove and we can contest those decisions. So here I would say that the EU is probably more sovereign than we give it credit for in this conversation.
Okay, so this was very interesting. I wanted to get back to the second part of my question for Dominique, and then also get Boris's response on this. I remember when I was a student at Sciences Po, I was studying from your book. This was in the early 2000s about European public opinion. There was a moment that I think your book captured a little bit after the Iraq War, when there was a Franco-German public sphere created in a critique of that Anglo-American, I don't know if I should use the word adventure, and there was something like a European public opinion coalescing around that. My question for you, Dominique, would be, do you see that as having progressed, consolidated, or deconsolidated? And that's another way of asking, is there a European public sphere that could be sovereign, a European public that could be sovereign in the sense in which you discussed it?
Okay, thank you. It's difficult to document an answer on this question. In 2004, 2003, 2004 was very interesting, because at this time we had not just surveys, but also huge phenomenon of demonstrations. So my book was based on the analysis of these demonstrations, thousands of demonstrations, not just in Europe, but specifically in Europe. And at this time, it was very clear for the first time, not just in surveys, that it was possible to observe the manifestation of a European public opinion. Since this moment is not, I don't have another materials like that in order to document my answer. But if I consider the different data by surveys, even if I consider the electoral results in all the countries, I consider that the process of globalization is pushing Europeans to ask the question, are you or not, as a leaders at a national level or the European level, are you able or not to protect us? If you are not able to protect us, because, for example, I'm in a small or medium country, which is the case of all the member states, I agree, I understand not the concept of European sovereignty, but the reality of a common power, not at the place of the national powers, but in order to support them, to help them to be more efficient. And this is the reason why, in my opinion, Europeans are waiting for this kind of common capacity in order to be able, through the elections and the expression of the common collective preferences, which is another way to talk about the popular sovereignty, to express a preference and to be able to observe the realization of this preference in a public policy, because the authority at the national or European level is able to do that, to deliver that. For example, Europeans are strongly waiting for a control of the border. Are you able to do that at the European level? Because Europeans are sure that the pertinent level is the European level for the borders. They are very, very clear on this aspect. But if the answer is, I'm sorry, I can't control, I can't protect the European borders. So in this context, a part of the Europeans are able to change their opinion and to go supporting populist movement in order to take back control at a national level. So now, in order to conclude on this aspect, just on this aspect, sorry, Boris, in order to end. But we are in a sort of medium position. At the national level is not enough. At the European level, it's not enough for the national level. At the European level is not enough, because we don't accept to develop this idea of European sovereignty, and it's not possible to propose to our citizens to live in a space, in a political sphere, without a sovereignty, or at the national or at the European level.
If I can just come in, Carlo, briefly, I agree with Dominique that all of us within the European Union, all member states ultimately were small or medium-sized countries when comparing ourselves with China or the United States or others. And we have no alternative realistically but to stick together to have enough weight to make an impact on the world scene. But what is missing, I think, and we haven't really developed in such a big way since 2003, is a public sphere, as you described it. There's a nice German word for it, Öffentlichkeit. Yeah. So there's not much of a public sphere. And so we have many of these discussions going on a national level without much reference to other debates that are going on. I would say one positive development is a medium like Politico, which is a pan-European medium where different national perspectives come together. But that's really very much the exception. And if you look at the vast majority of EU Europeans, where do they get their news from? It's basically from nationally based news sources. And so we don't have a common discourse. We don't have this public sphere.
So this is interesting. I want to bring in David and Anu on this question on how desirable EU sovereignty actually is, because it seemed to me Dominique expressed one form of why this could be a desirable thing. These medium and small countries need to band together to matter on the world, and it seemed to me Boris agreed. David, I know your book, I think, was a really interesting intervention in the Brexit debate in the United Kingdom, which of course took another option, which is take back control not at the EU level, but at the UK level. So do you think it is desirable for sovereignty to be transferred by these medium and small countries to the EU level, or is it a form of losing control?
Well, I think it's both. And I think it is, I mean, I think it is different for very small countries, as it were. I mean, it's different for Denmark, say, than it is for Britain or Germany or France, in so many different ways. I mean, you know, and these are countries, small countries have always been used to kind of being on the end of being rule takers, as it were, rather than rule makers. And it's much harder for big countries, you know, like Germany, France, Italy, Spain, UK, to kind of accept the imposition of rules. I mean, obviously there's certain rules, there's a degree of enlightened self-interest there, but I mean, yeah, I mean there is this deep, inherent, and unavoidable, and probably eternal tension between the idea of the kind of international cooperation, which is obviously, in globalization, the world becomes smaller, borders become more porous, not just economically, but also culturally. And that is, mainly an extraordinarily beneficial and benign development. It makes us all richer. It makes us all, more able to kind of learn from each other and so on and so forth. I mean, on the other hand, we also have a very important development, and I think one that we don't take sufficient account of, which is that we are miles more democratic than we were 70 years ago when the European Union started. I mean, democracy in its kind of modern European form is a very, very recent thing. I mean, there are almost people alive who kind of lived, well, hang on, no, it's, I mean, well, in many of our countries, women didn't get the vote until, the late 1920s. So there are actually people still alive who existed in what we would regard in many ways as sort of pre-democratic Europe. It's very recent, and it's gone through various stages. We're now in a much less elitist, much less deferential form of democracy. And that means people are much more concerned about the accountability of their politicians, about being able to control what happens, within their national spaces. And that's partly, populism is partly a reaction against the removal of voice from national citizens, whether it's to international organizations like the EU or to kind of legal constitutional apparatuses, which is just as important, I think, in some ways, in the kind of populist revolt, if you like, what one might call the kind of legitimate aspects of the populist revolt against the disappearance of so much power into legal channels or international organizations. And I think there are huge looming battles that the European Union is going to have to fight. I mean, if the bicycle theory is correct, and it has to keep integrating in order to survive. I think the good news is that Brexit has not destabilized the EU, at least not in the short term. And I think, even if, as I hope and expect the case to be, Britain flourishes outside the EU, I mean, there will be an economic price to pay, but I expect, in 10 or 15 years' time, Britain to be, just as good, in just as good a position, if not a better position, than it would be if it had stayed inside the European Union. So that might start to have an effect, but I doubt it, partly because the UK has always been somewhat exceptional. It's been sort of somewhat different in many ways to the other big countries in the European Union. So losing it is not a disaster, I don't think. But it's got huge, if the European Union is going to integrate further economically and become, in effect, a kind of transfer union,
then you've got the possibility that the rich countries are going to revolt. You know, we're going to have German disillusionment. You know, German Verdrossenheit is going to emerge. You know, somewhere down the road. And the other thing, of course, is for the European Union to function more efficiently, it's going to have more majority voting, and that is going to mean an even greater loss of national sovereignty. You know, and you know, we've already seen with Eastern European countries, Hungary and Poland, beginning to challenge, you know, some of the democratic fundamentals or the liberal fundamentals. So, I mean, I think, you know, this tension, this permanent tension, if you like, between kind of international sovereignty sharing and national identity and national democracy, and you know, because you know, the truth is you can only really have it at a national level. I mean, people were talking just now about the, you know, the lack of a European public space, and it's not going to come. I mean, or at least, you know, not in the next 100 years. We're not going to have that. So it's going to have to be a constant juggling game. Europe will always be a kind of peculiar hybrid. And you know, perhaps it'll swing a little bit this way and then a little bit that way, but and I think that's probably a good thing, and that's the best it should be seeking in some ways, because if it goes too far towards integration, there will be revolts in lots of countries, I think.
Interesting. So if I understand correctly, because I as a reader and admirer of your book, I never quite understood on what side you came down on the debate over Brexit. But if I understand what you were saying now, which is subtle and really interesting, am I correct in saying that you're saying sovereignty is actually not an either or? It's shared. It's always shared between the EU and the member states, and even a non-member state like the UK continues to share its sovereignty with the European Union. And it's a matter of degree, how much of the sovereignty is pooled and how much it retains at the national level, and we should not exceed in either direction, is what you're saying.
Yeah. I mean, you know, that's what politics will be, both at the European level and within nation states. I think you know, there will be a constant argument about it, and I don't think it's necessarily a one-way process. I think, you know, and other countries may leave when they find it unbearable, when they find that, you know, their own national identity, their own national priorities and preferences are threatened by the unavoidable homogenization that takes place when you have the, you know, Europeanization of politics. And I mean, you know, every country will come to its own sort of audit of where the balance of advantage lies. But and you will get you know, this whole concept of variable geometry. I mean, it's been around for 25 or 30 years, and you have seen it emerge in one or two areas. I think you'll probably see more and more aspects of variable geometry. Yeah, but I think
that's very,
yeah.
So I want to ask the last question to Anu on this question of normativity, and then open it up for discussions. I saw that some of you have already typed your questions in the Q&A. I invite you to start doing that. We have a few already, but Anu, is the Brussels effect a good thing? Or do you think it should be tempered, as David says, by more concern for national sovereignty? Or another question that I dare ask is, if I'm an American citizen, why should I be, you talked about legitimacy, why should I be subject to the Brussels effect? I did not nominate or have any role in determining who these bureaucrats in Brussels are, and they are making regulation that affects me. So what is the legitimacy externally of the Brussels effect, as well as internally?
So maybe quickly to that direct conversation, some American citizens might respond to you, because my own government has failed their task to regulate the market. They have been lobbied by the corporations without limits, to the extent that the current state of democracy is not reflected in the regulatory choices made by the US government. So that may be one way of saying that would be the argument of the second best. But in many ways, I think that's, and the question of legitimacy from the European side too, the EU is not forcing those choices on American companies. They are acting out of their business interest. They are trying to accomplish scale economies. They have decided to extend those rules also to American consumers because it is in their interest. But if I may take on the even broader question that you asked, whether sovereignty is a good or bad thing, and I really think there is no single answer to that. Because in many ways, it depends what is the optimal level of government in different issues. And there's a beautiful book by your two fellow Italians, Alessina and Spolaore, called The Optimal Size of the Nation. And they highlight this trade-off that if we think about how many countries, for instance, should form an international organization, there's a trade-off between the cost for providing public goods go down when you have more players, but also the heterogeneity cost go up. So there's an equilibrium where those two meet. And I think there's always the question to be asked that some issues we have not integrated and pooled the sovereignty enough in Europe. And that's what we faced with the pandemic, for instance. We did not have the capacity to handle the pandemics like this at the national level. At the same time, European Union did not have the health policy architecture, didn't have the experience in negotiating public procurement contexts like this. But then what Boris was also explaining earlier, who developed the vaccine? Even the European level sovereignty may not be enough. We actually need to think about harnessing the best of the global alliances and capabilities. And just vaccinating Europe, for instance, is not the solution. We actually need to think about vaccinating much more broadly. So in that sense, you cannot build a fortress and think that you are safe and able to provide some kind of public health goods to your own citizens. So in that sense, I think it's a very complicated question as to whether sovereignty is a good thing or bad thing. There are very troubling aspects of the conversation about strategic autonomy, especially some variants that have been advanced by France and occasionally with the support of Germany when it comes, for instance, to more industrial policy-driven competition policy that the European Union should pursue. And that's something that gives me a great pause and great concern that in many ways that how can we ensure the economic openness and our commitment in an interdependent world to global cooperation, which can be a very important way to advance Europe's strategic interests. We cannot do it by insulating. So I think it's a very subtle question. We need to have the capabilities. We need to be a stronger partner and an actor internationally. But ultimately, in today's interdependent world, few are truly sovereign.
Thank you very much, Anu. Really interesting. I'm going to move to some of the questions, but we can continue discussing all of these issues. I'm going to move to some of the questions that have been raised by our audience. So the first one is raised by Ivan Snook. Shout out to Ivan. And I think the first person that should answer it is Dominique, because it relates to some of the points you raised. But again, everybody can answer all question is, how is, I'm just going to read it out, how is popular sovereignty affected by emergency rule in which supranational executive power expands its power by reabsorbing itself into the economy, such as the transnational needs of big pharma? Are not such politics of emergency reversing the modern democratic project of constructing an autonomous political authority? So I think this is an interesting question because it poses the question of, does not the EU go against popular sovereignty? I take it in some sense. Dominique.
Just in order to answer quickly to this very complex question, but it's possible to consider that the supranational level is a pledge and a threat for the popular sovereignty. It's a threat, of course, if people are more and more considering that it's not pertinent to take part in the general elections, to be involved in the democratic life, because the power is not able to deliver. So in this case, and we are more or less in this kind of situation, in this case, we will have two movements. One is sort of defection, abstention, and the other could be protestation. populist vote. But the supranational level is also, on the other hand, a pledge. It's a pledge if it's the idea to gather at a supranational level more power in order to do the public power, the state level, or the public power more efficient in order to deliver what people are waiting for, what people voted for. In this case, it's a solution, an answer, and the possibility to combine the supranational sovereignty, for example, in the case of Europe, and a popular sovereignty, even in Europe, where it's very difficult, I know, to speak about European people. It's a great debate, but the question of the supranationality and the supranational influence is the present question for democratic order, because this is the context of the globalization. And I might just, Carlo, to add something concerning, in this context, a strong element we don't have to forget in this debate, because it's a trend. This is the demographic trend of Europe. It's impossible to think, I think, it's impossible to debate or to think about the possibility of a European sovereignty and what people are waiting for without a reflection on the demographic trend in Europe. And we know this trend. Europe is quickly aging, and this movement is linked, strongly linked, with the idea that we are losing capacity to influence our destinies. So it's an aspect of the dynamic of this demand, the feeling that we are more and more weaker and weaker, because in this world we are aging. And this is a reason why people are asking for efficiency at a national or a European level.
So this question of demographics is, of course, really interesting because it poses another question closely related to that of demographics, which is that of immigration. And we have a question about this. I guess I'll start posing it to Boris, but again, everybody can weigh in. Boris, this is an anonymous question. How is immigration challenging notions of sovereignty, both on the level of member states and the level of the EU as a whole, presuming the EU exercises some sovereign rights transferred to it?
So I think that's a very practical question, isn't it? And I think it's perhaps less, in my mind, of a theoretical issue, but it's something that has an immediate impact on politics, on emotions as well, in EU member countries that are exposed, or even EU member states that are not exposed. We can see that the issue of immigration has driven a lot of the populist politics across Europe, even in places where there were, practically no refugees to be seen. The question in my mind is, how are we going to deal with this demographic pressure coming out of Africa and the Middle East and even faraway places like Afghanistan? And the answer in my mind is we're going to have a better chance of addressing it if we stick together. And frankly, I disagree with David, perhaps, that a country the size of Britain or Germany or France in the 21st century really does not amount to much and is constantly at risk of being pushed around by those large actors. So Germany, we still pop up in some statistics as a significant player, but we are very, very much subject to pressures, whether they're economic, strategic, or whether they're pressures in terms of demography and immigration. So sticking together as EU member states and as the European Union is absolutely crucial to get a handle on these things.
David, do you want to respond to what Boris was saying?
Yeah, sure. I mean, yeah, I think immigration does go to the heart of national sovereignty. I mean, who you allow into your country, who becomes a fellow citizen, you know, changes the whole, or potentially changes the whole kind of character and nature of your society. So it is pretty fundamental. And obviously this has been one of the things that has been at least largely controlled at nation state level. With the exception of free movement, obviously, and indeed it was free movement that was probably the biggest single reason for the United Kingdom leaving the European Union. That sort of sense that you know, that's such an important sort of foundational aspect of what it is to be a society in some ways was no longer in our own hands. I mean, yeah, I mean, yeah, of course there are these global pressures, but I mean, I mean, Boris talks about, you know, big rich nation states like Germany and Britain as kind of sort of nothing. Well, I mean, obviously in a certain sense we're nothing, but we're not trying to, you know, this is not the kind of age of empire. This is not the 19th century. We're not trying to project power. We're just trying to stay ourselves. And that, in a sense, is the problem for the European Union. You know, if it doesn't allow sufficient voice at a national level, particularly over fundamental things like who can enter your country, the fear is that we won't be ourselves for very much longer. That, you know, we'll become part of some sort of homogenized sort of European blob, which nobody wants. Well, I mean, apart from a few people at elite institutions.
Is it true that the UK has turned into a blob? You know, if to the extent the UK has changed, and I don't want to turn this into a Brexit discussion. I mean, there's a lot of things inside the UK controlled by the UK government that have changed the fundamentals of British society in a very significant way, and as much or more than anything the European Union has done. And you know, you're quite right about sovereignty and movement and controlling who comes in. That's fine. So in that regard, the UK is now more sovereign. But when it comes to you know, the economy and trade and investment, I think the UK will have a very hard time.
It may be, but I mean, we have got off to quite a good start. I mean, the whole vaccine story, you know, is an absolute gift. I mean, I voted Remain, but I mean, it is an absolute gift to Brexiteers. Now, you may say, at some sort of technical level, we could have done much of what we did in the vaccine story, even if we'd remained in the European Union. But I mean, you know, that's the small print. I mean, the reality is, it's, or rather, the most powerful narrative is that it allowed us to be more nimble. It allowed us to be much, and it also allowed us to actually express our greater appetite for risk. You know, this is another thing that divides countries, and it's going to become more and more important. You know, different countries, different societies have different attitudes to risk. You know, Germanic societies tend to be quite risk shy, and Anglo-Saxon societies tend to be a little bit happier with taking on risk. And the vaccine story is a wonderful example of, you know, we took fantastic risks. I mean, Kate Bingham, who ran our vaccine program, was kind of taking out big bets on which of these vaccines was going to work, and she was right about enough of them. We then took quite a big risk in deciding that we could just give people one jab, and lots of European countries were much more cautious about that. And now, because they've had our example of it, they're following our lead. So yeah, I mean, so there are also very positive stories about not being part of what is unavoidably a slow-moving, big bureaucratic machine. Often for very good reasons. You will come back and say, well, it was for reasons of solidarity that we didn't allow. And there was an initial proposal, I think, for a few countries that actually had substantial pharmaceutical industries like Germany and the Netherlands to do the negotiation themselves. I think in retrospect, the European Union would have been a lot better if it actually, that would have been rather a good example of variable geometry working. But actually, you kind of ended up with the worst of all worlds. You kind of allowed a European Commission that had no experience in this area to negotiate it. So it made the UK's experience look absolutely fantastic. But yeah, I mean, all of these things are trade-offs, and I mean, and it'll be, it'll be really interesting to see on the immigration question whether the what's it called, Forex, not Forex, that's foreign exchange, isn't it? What's it called?
Frontex.
Frontex, of course, yeah. That whether Frontex can actually get its act together and become and provide the kind of reassurance about Europe's external border that most European citizens require, and whether indeed the law, the various Geneva Conventions that apply to refugees and so on. I mean, that in a sense is perhaps the prior question, when whether Europe actually has the stomach to to build a sufficiently strong external border, given that the dominant ethos of the European Union is openness, and the people that run the European Union tend to be very liberal-minded and tend to be in favor of large-scale immigration. Whether you can actually, and in that respect, they're generally at odds with the majority of their populations. I mean, and whether you can square that circle, in perhaps comes before the kind of technical business of whether Frontex has enough border guards or whatever.
I know that Anu has a point to raise about this exchange between Boris and David, but I gather it's not about Brexit.
Yeah, I actually, no matter how tempted I am to weigh in on the Brexit question, I wanted to raise another dimension of migration, which I think is absolutely integral to our question on how the EU can build more autonomy. And I think migration is both a necessity, given the demographics, plus also a huge opportunity. And when we talked in the beginning in my remarks, I mentioned how the EU is behind in developing these big technology companies. If you think about the source of American innovation, it is not American innovation only. If you think about the billion-dollar startups in America, 55% of those have an immigrant founder. If we think about all these key tech companies, Steve Jobs is a son of a Syrian immigrant. Jeff Bezos is a second-generation Cuban immigrant. Sergey Brin was born in Russia. Elon Musk in South Africa. Eduardo Saverin in Brazil. There is a tremendous international migrant-driven innovative potential that is fueling the technological sovereignty of the United States. And I think that is one of the biggest opportunities for Europe. And that is one example of that kind of open strategic autonomy that the EU is able to harness, hopefully, the best minds with proactive conscious migration policy. So certainly the Fortress Europe would be an antithesis to this kind of opportunity. So I would like to very strongly, as the recipe towards technological excellence and sovereignty, mention the importance of migration there.
Fascinating point.
Can I just, a very quick riposte to Anu on that? I mean, there's a really, really big problem at the heart of that assumption. I mean, wonderful and benign sounding though it is, and obviously it's true, that immigrants are a self-selecting group who tend to be more dynamic than the average member of a given society. But I would just throw back two words at you: brain drain. If we want these countries, these poor countries on our borders in Africa, in the Middle East, to develop, then for God's sake, stop nicking all their cleverest and most dynamic people. It's not really very complicated. So long as we go on doing that, those societies are going to remain stagnant, and their people are going to want to come to us, and they're going to die in their thousands in the Mediterranean, or we're going to have to shoot them at the border because our populations are not going to want very large numbers of them coming. So let's stop nicking all the clever people from those countries. Of course, that doesn't mean to say, well, let's bring them here. They can come to our universities. They can do stuff, and then they can go home. Okay, some of them might stay. They'll marry somebody or whatever. But let's be more realistic about what is required for those countries to develop to the level where they're not going to be pressing up against our borders.
Okay, thank you. We could make this into a Brexit debate or into an immigration debate. And that's a very interesting point you raised, David. I guess I would add also that nobody's nicking anybody. This is a voluntary move. Nobody's like sort of like nicking anybody, but it's an interesting, really difficult.
Well, no, we actually have, we inspire them to come. I mean, we do lure them in many ways. I mean, we have programs. Germany used to have programs to bring Indian software programmers in, and so on and so forth.
That's an interesting question. I want to move on because we have many more questions from the audience to another area. And I want to ask Boris a question that has been raised by Yanis Tsiligakis. In order for a certain place to assert sovereignty, it needs a common foreign policy. From how to deal with Russia, Turkey, and the US, it looks like Europe does not have a unified foreign policy. Is that an unsurmountable obstacle, and how can European foreign policy be homogenized?
I think that's an excellent question. And the short answer to that question in my mind is, again, sovereignty, from a practical point of view in terms of diplomacy and projecting power is not an absolute, it's a matter of degrees. So we've talked about some areas where the European Union does have some weight in the world and can claim to be, sovereign to a significant extent. In the field of traditional diplomacy and security policy, the EU is still at quite a low level. And I think it's a matter of improving by degrees. And from where I'm sitting, from a German point of view, I think the majority view here is that we should increase our capability to act, but we should not endanger our strong tie with the United States of America, that strong transatlantic bond, which is why a lot of people like myself prefer the term European sovereignty, which we think of as a positive term, as an aspirational term, to the notion of strategic autonomy, which claims something that does not exist in reality, number one. And number two, has the undertone of decoupling from the United States, which is something that we don't like.
Fascinating. I always thought sovereignty was stronger and that Macron retreated to strategic autonomy, but you are saying that it's actually the other way around. Sorry.
As a diplomat, I would say, Carlo, just to say, I know that when in a conversation with an American colleague, I say strategic autonomy, all the they become very unhappy. They become very stressed. So that's a measure of whether this is a useful term in my mind. Sovereignty, I think, from where they're sitting, is a softer view, more aspirational, less exclusive, if you like.
Fascinating. Last question for Dominique before we have to unfortunately wrap it up. And again, I couldn't raise all the questions. We've had many. But this is the name of the game. So last question for Dominique. Do you think that the linguistic diversity is a barrier to a shared public sphere / demos of Europe?
Yeah.
What is the biggest barrier? Can English be the European lingua franca, especially since Brexit and implication, especially since Brexit has implication that has, okay, especially since Brexit. I don't understand the last part of that question, but I think the point is clear.
Yeah, it's very clear. Very clear. It's a central question. It's possible to answer in one way and in another way. Firstly, it could be very difficult to imagine a European public sphere because of the pluralistic dimension of Europe in a linguistic way. It's in this context we could imagine that English will play the role of lingua franca, but obviously this way will be socially strongly biased. So it could be a sort of public sphere for the elites. But another way for the answer is possible, which is to not to imagine, because this is the trend. The trend is to imagine a European public sphere as a national public sphere larger. It's possible to imagine a European public sphere as a specific public sphere with new rules. For example, the possibility to use a plurality of languages, specifically due to the new opportunities offered by the numeric sphere, the platforms, and the new tools. But I think it's a mistake if we are trying to imagine the same for Europe. Europe is not a European country, a big European country. It is different. It's a cooperation between different countries. A European public sphere will be the same, not a very large public sphere with 500 million people speaking the same language, but new ways, new manners to exchange between us, to deliberate, to have a discussion about common problems, about common expectations. And we have common expectations in Europe. We have common problem. We have a common debate. We are talking in Europe, through Europe, about the same questions. We have also national questions, national issues, or local issues, but we also have national issues. So it's a public sphere. And we are doing that without a lingua franca. So I think the effort we have to develop is to imagine how it's possible to manage a different public sphere, allowing Europeans to use their own languages and not to threaten them to have to lose their languages before to be part of a European public sphere.
Thank you. Does anybody want to add to this or final remarks on anything to wrap it up? No?
I was just going to say, I mean, I think one of the interesting differences between Britain and most of the other member states was that national identity in the UK, for obvious reasons, couldn't be particularly wrapped up in our language, because our language is a global one, and nor was it particularly wrapped up in our, in our sort of cuisine, underrated though it is, of course. So our national identity was much more bound up in our political identity, in the kind of, in parliamentary sovereignty and our history and so on, but particularly a kind of a political identity, and that meant that our identity was much more interfered with by membership of the European Union, whereas I think many other European Union countries, their sense of themselves, their national identity is much more wrapped up in their language, in their way of life, in their cuisine and so on. And the European Union doesn't on the whole interfere with those things. So people can sort of separate out. But perhaps this in some ways also goes back to our initial discussion about sovereignty. You remain sovereign over the Italian language and Italian cuisine. The bloody bureaucrats can't interfere with that. They can interfere with your politics, but that's that's almost a sort of second order thing when it comes to identity anyway. Anyway, just a thought.
All right, well, thank you. Let me thank all the speakers. I will give the word to Francois, who I think will make closing remarks on behalf of all of you, but it was a pleasure And sorry if I was sometimes pushing you, but the goal was trying to create controversy. Francois.
Thank you, Carlo, and thanks to our panelists. I think it was really a great discussion. I learned a lot, although I think that the EU does interfere with national cuisines through norms on tomatoes and others. But well, it really a wonderful conclusion to our series of debates about the future of Europe. We would like also to thank our co-sponsors for this series, the Columbia Alumni Association, the Columbia Maison Française, Columbia University Libraries, the Institute for Ideas and Imagination, the Europe Legal Studies Center at the Law School, la revue Le Grand Continent, la Maison de l'Europe à Paris, and Sciences Po American Foundation. Also, this event was made possible thanks to the support of the Erasmus program of the European Union and of the advisory board of the Columbia Global Center in Paris. So many thanks. Have a nice afternoon and bonsoir.